Civil society. What is this? Well, usually when people use the phrase, they seem to use it as a kind of synonym for polite. This kind of rhetoric does not belong in civil society. And I guess that's true, but that's not necessarily how I mean civil society. So as it pertains to this video, and as others who have engaged in the subject also define it, civil society is everything that takes place between you and the state. All the organizations and associations that you take part in between that space comprise civil society. So what does that mean? It means schools, clubs, volunteer organizations, churches, your neighborhood, your community, the local charity, your job, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, your baseball team, your soccer team, your bowling league, your trivia night team at the bar, your book club, your history club, your union, the group you go with to pick up trash from the local park, your hunting group, your nonprofit group, your family, friends, and virtually every business in between. The term mediating institution can also be used as a synonym at times. So why is any of this important? Because this is where it all starts. This is where you come into society one person and you come out a more civilized, responsible, and fulfilled individual. It's where you build goodwill, fellowship, and the norms of reciprocity. It's where you develop the talents to constrain your human nature and become a more virtuous person. It's where you are educated in the values of democratic organization and the principles of a free society. This is where you interact with people, where you form bonds, relationships, friends, and a sense of feeling needed in your community. And that's one of the most important parts. Feeling needed in your community. Having a purpose. If you're even remotely familiar with the fields of psychology or evolutionary anthropology, you probably know that human beings are hardwired to be social creatures. We are driven to belong somewhere with other people. We all started out living in small bands of around 150 people for tens of thousands of years. That is the setting which has shaped our being, where we are seemingly most comfortable, and it is ingrained into our psyche. And I bring this up because one of the more common misunderstandings about human nature today is that because we in the West seem to have it so good economically compared to the rest of the world, and because we are so much more developed in our political institutions, that somehow human nature no longer applies to us. Somehow all the temptations associated with it have just disappeared. Somehow we beat it. Human nature is gone, problem solved. No. It's called human nature for a reason, encompassing both the good and the bad. And one of the most persistent forces throughout all of mankind, which is embedded in human nature, is the need to belong. People want to belong to their little tribe and feel valued for their work and for what they can contribute. And if you don't belong to such an institution, or if the rest of civil society has failed to civilize you, and when you have nothing else to turn to, you will revert back to the basic instincts of human nature and you will find yourself belonging to a tribal institution. And since tribal institutions are not in the mold of, or hold the standards of a decent and civilized society, these tribal institutions can be expressed in all sorts of unhealthy ways. From street gangs to pimps and pushers, the mafia, creepy cults, various supremacist clans, terrorism, and in this day and age of the internet, we get subcultures of vitriolic shitposters and raging incels who loathe in virtual communities. There are no constraints in that world. Anything goes. There are no limits to the perversions. But ultimately, for the people who can't find meaning in proper civil society, this is where they think they can belong. This is where they feel as though they can achieve real connection with people, where they have something to offer, in dangerous, unhealthy, and tribal institutions. And I say that they're tribal because the only reasoning that needs to be utilized is instinct. The logic of the tribe is what unites the dropouts of society to these places. You're reasoning with instincts and feelings into seeing these places as a type of refuge, as places that explain the world you found yourself in, as places that put it all in its right order, when in reality, they're nothing more than a self-destructive and chaotic mess. And what's the most important thing here? Defending the tribe and attacking any perceived enemy, based purely on tribal reasoning. Us good, other bad, and evil. So that's why civil society is important. It has been the primary source of civilizing human beings, of taming our basic tribal instincts and directing our passions and capabilities toward productive and beneficial ends, for both the individual and the community at large. It's what the renowned French historian and political philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville observed about America during his visit across the country. The spirit of individuality is the basis of the English character. Association is a means of achieving things unattainable by isolated effort. What better example of association than the union of individuals who form the club, or almost any civil or political association or corporation? Now, most of my thinking in this video comes from a variety of sources, but primarily these books, which are listed in the description, the authors of which have done an enormous job at exposing some of the underlying problems in the country right now, and have been incredibly helpful to me. And now more than ever seems like a pretty good time to make a video on this topic. Why? Well, because civil society is decaying, it's retreating. As the country continues to become more polarized, tribal, and all around indecent, and as people retreat into lives of isolation and loneliness, our mediating institutions have been slowly crumbling in the background. Today, Americans feel more unhappy and meaningless than ever before. A February 2018 Gallup ShareCare Well-Being Index, which included more than 2.5 million surveys, showed an overall decline in national well-being, the largest decline in the index's 10-year history. Fewer Americans in these states said they liked what they did each day. More Americans in these states said they worried each day. They showed an increase in clinical diagnoses of depression, with more people reporting that they had little interest or pleasure in doing things. And according to a new survey last year from healthcare provider Cigna, the survey of more than 20,000 US adults ages 18 and older revealed some alarming findings. Nearly half of Americans report sometimes or always feeling alone, 46%, or left out, 47%. 1 in 4 Americans rarely or never feel as though there are people who really understand them. 2 in 5 Americans sometimes or always feel that their relationships are not meaningful, 43%, and that they are isolated from others. 1 in 5 people report they rarely or never feel close to people, or feel like there are people they can talk to. More than that, we're now more politically polarized than ever before in this country, with 27% of Democrats seeing the Republican Party as a threat to the nation's well-being, and 36% of Republicans seeing the Democratic Party as a threat to the nation's well-being. As a study from More in Common on the tribalism in America concluded, when individuals feel threatened, they retreat within narrow tribal identities that provide a sense of security and belonging. These narrow tribal identities often clearly define who counts as us and who counts as them. We are becoming more isolated, more fractured, and more polarized. As the Cigna study on loneliness concluded, we are seeing a lack of human connection, which ultimately leads to a lack of vitality, or a disconnect between mind and body. And I would also add that we're becoming more disconnected between mind and community. Now that's just a hint of some of the deeper problems going on in America, all of which are affecting our institutions of civil society. And now we can really measure the decay. And the categories that I'll be listing to measure that decay are what I consider to be the most significant to this topic. There may be others that you think are significant, but these are my primary concerns. So let's start with the family. In all of human history, the most essential unit of civilization has been the domestic family. Family is what outfits you with the proper customs, norms, morals, knowledge, and socialization necessary to function in the broader society. But more importantly, the domestic family realizes a kind of obligation to the rest of the community. And it is precisely those interactions between family and other social institutions that help build stability, trust, security, and a thriving community. But over the course of the last half century, all of this has been falling apart. Today, children are less likely to grow up with both parents in the household. You can count me in as part of that statistic. And first and foremost, this has been due primarily to an increasing rate of divorce. As Bradford Wilcox, director of the National Marriage Project, writes in The Evolution of Divorce, approximately half of the children born to married parents in the 1970s saw their parents part, compared to only 11% of those born in the 1950s. But no matter the reason for a couple getting divorced, the impact on the children growing up in that circumstance is probably one of the more significant measures. Wilcox continues and writes that since 1974, about 1 million children per year have seen their parents divorce, and children who are exposed to divorce are 2 to 3 times more likely than their peers in intact marriages to suffer from serious social or psychological pathologies. He goes on to note the research of sociologists Sarah McLanahan and Gary Sandifer, who found out that 31% of adolescents with divorced parents dropped out of high school, compared to 13% of children from intact families. They also concluded that 33% of adolescent girls whose parents divorced became teen mothers, compared to 11% of girls from continuously married families. McLanahan and her colleagues have found that 11% of boys who come from divorced families end up spending time in prison before the age of 32, compared to 5% of boys who come from intact families. And as sociologist Paul Amato estimates, if the United States enjoyed the same level of family stability today as it did in 1960, the nation would have 750,000 fewer children repeating grades, 1.2 million fewer school suspensions, approximately 500,000 fewer acts of teenage delinquency, about 600,000 fewer kids receiving therapy, and approximately 70,000 fewer suicide attempts every year. And these numbers are also important because they reflect just how much socialization occurs in a child from living in a married couple household. The nature of the relationships that occur within the structure of a marriage serve to civilize and orient children towards right behavior. to such an extent that you will have, as Charles Murray lists in Coming Apart, less delinquency in adolescence, criminality as adults, illness and injury as child, early mortality, sexual decision-making in adolescence, school problems and dropping out, poor emotional health, and other such negative outcomes. And another factor that Tim Carney notes in his book Alienated America is that about 8% of children born to married parents end up in poverty as adults, while about 27% of children born to unmarried parents do. Children born to unmarried parents are more than twice as likely to have no high school degree by age 20 and less than half as likely to earn a decent income. These are neither mere economies of scale or some moralistic idea of the right way to do things. There's tons of hard data showing that kids who grow up in intact families do better as adults. And returning to the paper from Brad Wilcox, when children see their parents divorce because they have simply drifted apart, or because one or both parents have become unhappy or left to pursue another partner, the kid's faith in love, commitment, and marriage is often shattered. In the wake of their parents' divorce, children are also likely to experience a family move, marked declines in their family income, a stressed out single mother, and substantial periods of paternal absence, all factors that put them at risk. In other words, the clear majority of divorces involving children in America are not in the best interests of children. But in large part, this is a culture that is most pervasive in lower class Americans, which is a significant reversal from the early 20th century. A culture of out-of-wedlock births with no impetus for getting or staying married is not a conducive formula for a healthy community, nor for an economically, educationally, or psychologically secure child growing up in that circumstance. And the community where this lifestyle is most pervasive and has had absolutely devastating results is the African American community. As of 2015, the National Center for Health Statistics reported that 77.3% of all black babies born in America will be born to a single mother. And this is a trend that has been building ever since the middle of the 20th century. As Thomas Sowell writes in The Vision of the Anointed, in every decennial census from 1920 to 1960 inclusive, at least 60% of all black males from age 15 on up were currently married. Moreover, the difference between black and white males in this respect was never as great as 5 percentage points during this entire era. Yet, by 1980, less than half of all black males in these age brackets were currently married, and the gap between black and white males was 17 percentage points. By 1992, that gap had widened to 21 percentage points. And according to the Bureau of the Census, in 1950, 78% of black families consisted of a married couple household, while only 18% consisted of a single mother family. And you can see how that's gone off course in the last half century. In fact, the current out-of-wedlock birth rate for whites is higher than it was for blacks when Daniel Patrick Moynihan released his report in 1965, which documented the breakdown of the African American family. What has happened to black families in America in the second half of the 20th century is absolutely depressing. A similarly high percentage of illegitimate birth rates can also be found in the Hispanic community, where 56.9% of all Hispanics are born to unmarried mothers. Now, some might try to make the argument that this is just a matter of education, that if only people were educated more, this wouldn't be happening. But that is counterintuitive to the reality of the last century. As Yuval Levin writes in The Fractured Republic, in 1955, roughly 4.5% of children born in the United States were born to unmarried mothers. By 1965, that figure had risen to 7.7%. By 1975, it was 14.3%. In 1985, it was 22%. In 1995, it was 32%. In 2005, it was 37%. And in 2015, according to preliminary census figures, it looks to have been just over 41% of births. The out-of-wedlock birth rates in this country were lower during a time when fewer Americans were educated than they are today. And as Tim Carney notes from the US Census Bureau, nearly 90% of all adults were married by age 30 in the mid-1950s. This norm applied roughly equally to both white-collar adults and working-class adults. Almost all babies were born to married couples. 90% of all first births occurred after the parents' marriage, and about 1 in 9 of those infants was conceived before the marriage. Clearly, people knew to get married and not do certain things regardless of the amount of education they received back then. The values that people of the past inherited were a result of culturally transmitted norms, which in today's world have been unraveling. In fact, in the last few decades, out-of-wedlock birth rates have been increasing among women of all education levels. But while rates among the educated have always been lower than those who aren't, it's still been a noticeable rise of the last half century. In fact, out-of-wedlock birth rates for the entire world have been going up since 1964 according to the OECD. And as Isabel Sawhill at the Brookings Institution writes in the New York Times, more than 40% of new mothers are unmarried. Many young adults drift into parenthood unintentionally. They may be cohabiting at the time of their child's birth, but about half of these couples will have split up by the time their child is 5 years old. College-educated young adults are still marrying before having children and planning their families more intentionally. The rest of America, about 2/3 of the population, is not. Moreover, as it pertains to the general public's understanding or perception of what the institution of marriage and family are supposed to be, they went from being viewed through what Brad Wilcox writes as the prisms of duty, obligation, and sacrifice, to the new attitude of marriage as stated by Jonah Goldberg as being, marriage had better work for me. This was something that sociologist Robert Nisbet predicted would happen back in the early 1950s in his book The Quest for Community, where he notes how the diminution in the functional significance of the family has been compensated by the affectional realm of intensified romance. If there is no greater purpose to the marriage or to the family structure overall, then people will start finding reasons. In this view, that reason is found solely in the realm of romance. And if you're just looking for romance, then you don't necessarily need to be married for that. As a YouGov survey in 2017 found, 1 in 6 Americans now think that marriage is an outdated institution. But it's not just the structure of the marriage itself that changes with this new attitude. Robert Nisbet also notes how changing the functional purpose of the marriage changes the functional positions of the members of the family, to the point where basic societal rituals and traditions associated with the family and its relationship to the broader community start to make less and less sense and facilitate social incoherency. If marriage and family rearing are no longer being associated with something larger than the psychological fulfillment of each individual's desires, then it's no wonder that marriage has been collapsing. Oh, we don't like each other anymore? Yeah, we're done. That's it. That was the sole purpose of our marriage. The kids will be alright. No, the kids are not alright.
That boy ain't right.
But anyway, to the extent that marriage continues to be pushed on young adults, which honestly I don't see it being all that compulsory anymore, it's sort of being done haphazardly. Because if there's no deeper understanding to what the marriage itself is supposed to entail, other than staying with someone you like for a long time, then there's no real reason for it. No one really seems to know what the purpose of this institution is supposed to be anymore. And at the very worst, it becomes viewed as nothing but an authoritarian institution, denying your autonomy to do whatever you want to do. As Wilcox writes, a successful, happy home was one in which intimacy was an important good, but by no means the only one in view. A decent job, a well-maintained home, mutual spousal aid, child rearing, and shared religious faith were seen almost universally as the goods that marriage and family life were intended to advance. But the psychological revolution's focus on individual fulfillment and personal growth changed all that. Increasingly, marriage was seen as a vehicle for a self-oriented ethic of romance, intimacy, and fulfillment. In this new psychological approach to marriage life, one's primary obligation was not to one's family, but to oneself. Hence, marital success was defined not by successfully meeting obligations to one's spouse and children, but by a strong sense of subjective happiness in the marriage, usually to be found in and through an intense emotional relationship with one's spouse. The 1970s marked the period when, for many Americans, a more institutional model of marriage gave way to the soulmate model of marriage. And this new form of relationship and sexual inquiry has major impacts on the success of future relationships and the corresponding levels of happiness. Because as you move around from one partner to another and one marriage to another, seeking to satisfy personal appetites, then you're going to continually have a worse time of it. In a report from the National Marriage Project, one of their major conclusions was that what happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas, so to speak. Our past experiences, especially when it comes to love, sex, and children, are linked to our future marital quality. Prior research suggests that if the only person you had sex with prior to marriage was your eventual spouse, your odds of marital stability are good. Data collected in the 1990s on women who married a generation ago, men weren't included, showed that women who had sex with only their future spouse before marriage were at no greater risk for divorce than those who waited until marriage to have sex. But in this study, only 23% of the individuals who got married had had sex solely with the person they married, and that minority of men and women reported higher marital quality than those who had had sex with other partners prior to marriage. We further found that the more sexual partners a woman had had before marriage, the less happy she reported her marriage to be. And along with this, there are 2 other related premarital risk factors for low marital quality in our research sample: having lived with someone other than a future spouse and/or having been previously married. These findings echo other research showing that having cohabited with multiple partners is a risk factor for divorce, and that second marriages are more prone to divorce than first marriages. And aside from this, I'm not even sure that many Americans today even appreciate the extent to which economic security and prosperity are tied to marriage. Returning back to Isabel Sawhill, quote, "Even some of our biggest social programs, like food stamps, do not reduce child poverty as much as unmarried parenthood has increased it." As Jim Tankersley summarizes in his 2015 Washington Post article, according to new research from the American Enterprise Institute, states with a high concentration of married couples experience faster economic growth, less child poverty, and more economic mobility than states where fewer adults are married, even after controlling for a variety of economic and demographic factors. The study also finds that the share of parents who are married in a state is a better predictor of that state's economic health than the racial composition and educational attainment of that state's residents. This is in large part due to the psychological motivators and incentive structures that come with marriage, especially for men. As Brad Wilcox writes, "Marriage does seem to encourage men to get their act together. They have a sense of responsibility. Their parents, their in-laws, their spouse, their neighbors and friends, all these people in their lives are expecting them to be more responsible, and they expect themselves to be more responsible." The study finds labor force participation is substantially higher among married men with children than it is among unmarried men without them. And as the study itself summarizes, the state-level link between marriage and economic growth is stronger for younger adults, ages 25 through 35, than for older adults, 36 to 59. This suggests that marriage plays a particularly important role in fostering a positive labor market orientation among young men. Even crime is reduced in states with a higher proportion of married couples. Violent crime is much less common in states with larger shares of families headed by married parents, even after controlling for a range of socio-demographic factors at the state level. But now we need to answer another question. Where does this collapse in marriage come from? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. For one, much of it comes from the divorce culture that has been growing in this country ever since no-fault divorce laws were enacted in the 1970s. And from that spawned a number of entertainment programs and cultural elites proclaiming that the divorce life was great, even liberating. Popular programs and movies like Kramer vs. Kramer or Murphy Brown helped to normalize the collapse of the family and out-of-wedlock births, and created a new understanding of what the family was supposed to mean for people.
What are you doing out by yourself?
Getting divorced. I'm leaving you.
Was this some kind of joke?
Thomas Sowell in The Vision of the Anointed quotes a saying from a member of the Institute for Human Development at UC Berkeley in 1992. After 3 decades of social upheaval, the outlines of a new family are beginning to emerge. It's more diverse, more fragile, and more fluid than in the past. There's also the role that the pill has had. Having access to birth control gives a lot more options for women, mainly economic, but this would also do a lot to separate out the role of sex from marriage itself. As Mark Regnerus wrote in the Wall Street Journal in 2017, birth control's widespread adoption by women in recent decades not only boosted their educational and economic fortunes, but also reduced their dependence on men. As the risk of pregnancy radically declined, sex shed many of the social and personal costs that once encouraged women to wait. But these are probably 2 of the biggest reasons out there. And from here, we get the common theme of woman's liberation from the chains of marriage. But there's something else going on here with the liberation narrative. For a lot of cultural conservatives, it's become a bit of a mantra to point at rich celebrities and highly educated elites and say that their influence is what's really been driving the decline in marriage. And that's not an unreasonable position to take. Many do often talk about the freedom from marriage and the freedom of not having to commit. And while that's definitely not without its influence, for much of the quote-unquote elite, they don't actually live by what they preach. And in fact, much of the female liberation narrative seems to be completely flipped on its head once you look at the statistics. Here's the general narrative. Educated women have more economic and social opportunities in life. Therefore, they get married less because they aren't confined to a small town with hardly any opportunities. So, the more educated women are, the more liberated they become from the stranglehold of marriage. This is generally the thought process associated with women's liberation, and is why the liberal pundit Matt Yglesias wrote in 2015, "In places where women have very few economic opportunities, they can't afford to be too choosy about marriage partners. Where women are more empowered, they become choosier." This is not totally true. By nearly all metrics, women who are more educated are more likely to be married, while women who are less educated and lower income are less likely to be married. People who supposedly have the fewest economic opportunities. And Tim Carney notes this reversal in his book Alienated America, where the retreat from marriage is most profound in the working class. As he cites from scholar Kay Heimowitz, when it comes to the family, America really has become 2 nations. The old-fashioned married couple with children model is doing quite well among college-educated women. It is primarily among lower-income women with only high school education that it is in poor health. And as Richard Reeves, Isabel Sawhill, and Eleanor Krauss wrote in an article at the Brookings Institution, the most educated women are the most likely to be married. And according to Brad Wilcox and Andrew Sherlin, in the affluent neighborhoods where many college-educated Americans live, marriage is alive and well, and stable families are the rule. Tim Carney continues and says that the gap in marriage between educated and non-educated Americans is growing. In 1990, about 2/3 of all adults over 25 were married, with only a slight advantage, 6 percentage points, for the higher educated. By 2017, only half of those who never went to college were married, and the gap between the highly educated and the less educated had more than doubled. This undermines the assertion that the death of marriage represents liberation. If marriage were a bum deal foisted on women who lacked opportunity, you'd expect the most liberated women, those with college degrees, decent incomes, and good prospects, to be the ones shedding marriage. They're not. The elite women are practicing what social conservatives have long preached: getting married, having kids with their husband, in that order, and raising the kids actively. Pop culture may not reflect that fact, but the numbers show it. And these elites live within bubbles where traditional families are the norm. And so while all of this information takes care of the marriage side of things, I think it's also necessary to dive into a subcategory of marriage, and that being the role of cohabitation in America. A National Health Statistics report on trends and attitudes about marriage, childbearing, and sexual behavior from 2016 found that from 2002 to 2011 through 2013, there was an increase in the percentages of men and women who agreed with premarital cohabitation and non-marital childbearing. Regardless of age group, about 2/3 of men agreed. Living together before marriage may help prevent divorce. More variation was observed among women, with a higher percentage of those aged 25 to 34, 64.2%, agreeing with the statement compared with those ages 35 to 44, 55.7%. In 2011 through 2013, 3/4 of women and men agreed it is okay to have and raise children when the parents are living together but not married. Percentages were similar in 2006 through 2010. Women aged 25 to 34 were more likely to agree with this statement, compared with women aged 35 to 44, and the percentage of women aged 15 to 24 who agreed, 74.4%, did not differ significantly from the other two age groups. There were no significant differences among the age groups for men. The percentage of respondents who agreed it is okay for an unmarried female to have and raise a child increased over time. Among women, 69.5% agreed in 2002, 78.4% agreed in 2006 to 2010, and 78.3% agreed in 2011 to 2013. Among men, 58.9% agreed in 2002, 70.1% agreed in 2006 to 2010, and 69.2% agreed in 2011 to 2013. None of the supposed benefits of these beliefs are supported with any hard evidence. As Michael McManus, president of the Marriage Savers organization and author of the book Living Together, stated in an interview with National Review, couples who live together are gambling and losing in 85% of the cases. Many believe the myth that they are in a trial marriage. Actually, it is more like a trial divorce, in which more than 8 out of 10 couples will break up either before the wedding or afterwards in divorce. First, about 45% of those who begin cohabiting do not marry. Those who undergo premarital divorce often discover it is as painful as the real thing. Another 5 to 10% continue living together and do not marry. These two trends are the major reason the marriage rate has plunged 50% since 1970. Couples who cohabit are likely to find that it is a paltry substitute for the real thing, marriage. Of the 45% of those who do marry after living together, they are 50% more likely to divorce than those who remain separate before the wedding. When the interviewer responded back to him, "Isn't it practical sometimes?" McManus responded, "No, never. A Penn State study reports that even a month's cohabitation decreases the quality of the couple's relationship. Cameras were placed in living rooms, which recorded that couples who began their marriage living together were more negative when they discussed an issue, more demeaning, more flippant, more likely to deride the other person. Couples who had never cohabited, by contrast, have far more respect for one another and settled issues more amicably. Thus, negative patterns of behavior learned in cohabitation came into the marriages and destroyed a higher percentage of them." And in a journal from the University of North Carolina called Cohabitation and Marital Stability in the United States from 1990, the authors found that cohabiting unions are less stable than marriages, and that premarital cohabitation increases the risk of subsequent marital instability. A 2004 American Psychological Association study found that the before engagement cohabitors had more negative interactions, lower interpersonal commitment, lower relationship quality, and lower relationship confidence than those who did not cohabit until after engagement or marriage, even after controlling for selection factors and duration of cohabitation. Our findings suggest that those who cohabit before engagement are at a greater risk for poor marital outcomes than those who cohabit only after engagement or at marriage. And a National Institute of Health journal from 2002 also reported that cohabiting relationships are less stable than marriages and that instability is increasing. How many relationships engage in cohabitation? Well, as Larry Bumpus and Hen Liu found in 2000, the proportion of births to unmarried women born into cohabiting families increased from 29 to 39% in the period 1980 through 84 to 1990 through 94, account for almost all of the increase in unmarried childbearing. And as Charles Murray notes in Coming Apart, in the 1990s, about 40% of all births to single women actually occurred to women who were cohabiting with the biological father of the baby, and presumably that percentage grew during the 2000s. And who are these women cohabiting and having children out of wedlock? The mothers in cohabiting couples tended to have lower education, to be younger, to have poorer psychological adjustment, less social support, and less money than the married mothers. Cohabiting mothers come disproportionately from the lower socioeconomic classes, and they tend to provide worse environments for raising children than married mothers. But more importantly here, again, is the children that are growing up in that circumstance. Children pick up on things from their immediate surroundings. If cohabitation is the culture they are born into, they are more likely themselves to engage in such practices as they grow up. As the National Institute of Health study continues, parents who cohabit may find it difficult to argue effectively that their children should abstain from unmarried sex or cohabitation, leading to even more widespread acceptance and practice of cohabitation in the future. And more than that, in nearly every piece of data available, we know that children growing up in cohabiting households are simply going to be at a developmental disadvantage beginning in infancy. Researchers Stacey Aronson and Aletha Huston found that married mothers and their infants demonstrated more positive behavior and received higher home observation for measurement of the environment scores when the infant was 6 and 15 months old than did their cohabiting and single counterparts. Married families were also better off than single and cohabiting families on several demographic, parent personality, financial, and social context measures. Moreover, as Charles Murray noted, the disadvantages of being born to cohabiting parents extend into childhood and adolescence, even when the cohabiting couple consists of the two biological parents. Susan Brown used the 1999 cohort for the National Survey of America's Families to examine behavioral and emotional problems and school engagement among 6 to 11-year-olds and 12 to 17-year-olds. Same story. Having two unmarried biological parents was associated with worse outcomes than having two married biological parents, and the outcomes were rarely better than for those living with a single parent or in a cohabiting step-parent family. If you are interested in the welfare of children, knowing that the child was born to a cohabiting woman instead of a lone unmarried woman should have little effect on your appraisal of the child's chances in life. That's the common theme of the systematic studies of this issue for more than 20 years.
A warm, stable home life is necessary for kids to flourish, and parental commitment is a crucial part of maintaining such an environment. My own research indicates that children born to cohabiting parents are about twice as likely to see their parents break up compared to kids born to married parents. Even in countries like Norway and France, children are about 90% more likely to see mom and dad break up by the time they turn 12 if their parents are cohabiting versus married at birth. The risks are especially high when children face a revolving cast of caretakers and unrelated adults in the home, particularly when those unrelated adults are men. Let's compare the outcomes of two hypothetical, yet representative children. Sarah, a child living with her mom and a cohabiting boyfriend who is not her dad, and Amanda, whose parents are married. In grade school and middle school, Sarah will be more than 4 times more likely to experience serious emotional problems than Amanda. Sarah is also twice as likely to get expelled, suspended, or struggle in school. By high school, it's twice as likely that Sarah will have tried marijuana. But the biggest danger to Sarah is that she will face a much higher risk of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse.
This will create a fundamental shift in the culture, in the value placed on certain institutions and norms. And the more that the culture promotes the lifestyles and behaviors seen in households and communities where cohabiting, out-of-wedlock births, and rejection of marriage are the norm, the worse it will be for the children growing up in that circumstance, and the worse it will be for the society at large. As the famous quote from Ron Haskins of the Brookings Institution goes, "At least finish high school, get a full-time job, and wait until 21 to get married and have children." Of the families that did these 3 things, only 2% of them remained in poverty, while 75% have joined the middle class. Now that covers the family, and now we move on to the next category. Now, as an essential part of civil society is engaging with other people, the fact that friendships, and not just casual acquaintances, but real, meaningful friendships, have declined in America is another indicator of the decline in civil society. But more to the point, human association is on the decline. Because part of the whole idea here is that you are forming meaningful relationships with other people. If that's not happening, then you're not only distancing yourself from that basic human need to bond with people, but you're removing your ability to practice your human virtues, being a good neighbor, a good friend, a good community member. And one person who made this issue most popular is sociologist Robert Putnam, who pointed out in 1999 in his book Bowling Alone, and as it pertains directly to the title of that book, that there were more people than ever before in America who went out bowling. But there was also the fewest amount of people who bowled as part of a bowling league than ever before. In fact, at the time of writing his book, league bowling had plummeted. Between 1980 and 1993, the total number of bowlers in America increased by 10%, while league bowling decreased by more than 40%. Now, bowling isn't just some trivial activity. In 1996 alone, more than 91 million Americans bowled at some point in the year according to the Statistical Abstract of the United States. But the broader point of Putnam's book was that certain associational attachments, both formal and informal, and community engagement in general, had been declining in America. Aside from just bowling, things like public meetings on town or school-related affairs had their attendance decreased 35% from 1973 to 1994. The number of people who had served as an officer of some club or organization was down 42% from 1973 to 1994. And the number of people who served on a committee for some local organization was down 39%. And one other characteristic of such associations that Putnam notes as being in decline is the simple act of having friends over. The practice of entertaining friends seems to be vanishing entirely. Informal outings like picnics also seem to be on the path to extinction. The number of picnics per capita was slashed by nearly 60% between 1975 and 1999. Americans are spending a lot less time breaking bread with friends than we did 20 or 30 years ago. Just as a side note, I went to Montpelier a few months ago and found out that James Madison had about 20 people come over for dinner almost every night during his retirement. But even more significant than that, as Putnam goes on to note, is that even the fraction of married Americans who say definitely that our whole family usually eats dinner together has declined by over a third over the last 20 years, from about 50% to 34%. And the number of people for whom eating together isn't a customary practice increased from 16% to 27%. And the proportion of adults dining alone roughly doubled during this period. The simple act of getting together with a lot of people and just eating things is a basic feature of all human societies. This is an experience shared by our ancestors for tens of thousands of years, and even this basic ritual has been coming apart. And remember, Putnam published his book in 1999, so these trends have long been established throughout the preceding decades. But there's another aspect of this type of disassociation with others that sociologist Philip Slater noted in his 1970 book, The Pursuit of Loneliness. We seek a private house, a private means of transportation, a private garden, a private laundry, self-service stores, and do-it-yourself skills of every kind. An enormous technology seems to have set itself the task of making it unnecessary for one human being to ever ask anything of another in the course of going about his daily business. Even within the family, Americans are unique in their feeling that each member should have a separate room, and even a separate telephone, television, and car when economically possible. We seek more and more privacy, and feel more and more alienated and lonely when we get it. And in an article by Richard Thomas in the Palimpsest in 1975, he noticed how the architecture of our houses were starting to become less focused on the front porch, where you can see your neighborhood and community, and more focused on the back patio, away from people and more isolated. So in the aggregate, we do not engage in our communities as much as we did in the mid-20th century. We isolate ourselves more often within our own neighborhoods and our own homes, and we are leaving ourselves with less room to develop meaningful relationships.
I may finally have found a place where I can be all alone. I gotta get out of here!
As Jacqueline Olds and Richard Schwartz noted in their book The Lonely American, using data from the General Social Survey, a group headed by Duke University researcher Miller McPherson found that between 1985 and 2004, the number of people with whom the average American discussed important matters dropped from 3 to 2. Even more stunning, the number of people who said there was no one with whom to discuss important matters tripled. In 2004, individuals without a single confidant now made up nearly a quarter of those surveyed. Our country is now filled with them. For readers who remain skeptical, it is worth noting that the authors of the study themselves were skeptics. They were surprised by their own results. They had expected to prove Putnam wrong. When you don't have people close to you who you feel like you can dispel your deepest thoughts with, or just to talk something through with, you're just more likely to feel alone in the world. Or even worse, that you are just a world unto yourself. A kind of atomistic solipsism, or anomie. And this even translates over to the romantic realm, where according to new data from the General Social Survey, more than half of young people in America don't have a steady romantic partner. But if all of these statistics are any indicator, we just simply aren't doing things with people, both formally or informally.
You're invited for dinner.
What?
Pick a night.
Are you a host? Why?
Do you know many people here?
No.
Are you living off hotel food?
It's not a good idea.
Oh, please don't be an arsehole about it. Believe me, I don't really want to do it either, but it's what people do.
Is it?
Yes, they have their bosses round. We don't have to talk about work.
What are we talking about?
I don't know. Just say yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bloody hell.
And in Coming Apart, Charles Murray lays out a multitude of examples of just how many associations and organizations there were in America's past, even in the most sparsely populated regions, and just how all-encompassing they were across social and economic classes. The reach and scope of these voluntary associations by the end of the 19th century and reaching into the first decades of the 20th century has been largely forgotten. Cultural historian Marvin Olasky pulled together data that gives a sense of the profusion of activities. Here, for example, is the roster of activities conducted by associations affiliated with 112 Protestant churches in Manhattan and the Bronx at the turn of the 20th century, 48 industrial schools, 45 libraries or reading rooms, 44 sewing schools, 50 kindergartens, 29 small sum savings banks and loan associations, 21 employment offices, 20 gymnasia and swimming pools, 8 medical dispensaries, 7 full-day nurseries, and 4 lodging houses. Those are just some of the Protestant churches in 2 boroughs of New York City, and it is not a complete list of the activities shown in the report. These kinds of associations were meaningful to people. They were part of their identities and livelihoods. And as Theda Skocpol noted in her 2003 book, Diminished Democracy, these associations involved people of all backgrounds. Read biographical sketches of prominent men and women of the past, and you will see proudly proclaimed memberships and officerships in a wide array of the same fraternal, veterans, women's, and civic associations that also involved millions of non-elite citizens. Those who were leaders had to care about inspiring large numbers of fellow members. Members counted, and leaders had to mobilize and interact with others from a wide range of backgrounds or they were not successful. To get ahead within associations, ambitious men and women had to express and act on values and activities shared with people of diverse occupational backgrounds. And one of the more striking examples to me in Charles Murray's book was the extent of civic associations in early 20th century Iowa. When Iowa mounted a food conservation program in World War I, it engaged the participation of 9,630 chapters of 31 different secular fraternal associations. It is a number worth pausing to think about. 9,630 in one lightly populated state. But these kinds of associations have been fading away, and the connections people would make from being a part of these associations has also faded. The opening chapters of Robert Putnam's book lays out a multitude of other organizations that have seen their memberships decline over the last half-century. Across a very wide range of activities, the last several decades have witnessed a striking diminution of regular contacts with our friends and neighbors. We spend less time in conversations over meals. We exchange visits less often. We engage less often in leisure activities that encourage casual social interaction. We spend more time watching, admittedly some of it in the presence of others, and less time doing. We know our neighbors less well, and we see old friends less often. In short, it is not merely do-good civic activities that engage us less, but also informal connecting. This is deeply troubling stuff, as will become much clearer later on in this video. But as it pertains to the immediate human needs and desires, we are depriving ourselves of our relational nature. We are becoming more isolated and less involved in associational life. More and more now, we're becoming worse off to even be able to manage living in a democracy and the responsibilities that entails. If you don't live in a community where you and your neighbors really know each other, or if you don't have friends that you can actually rely on and whose relationship with them is meaningful to you, there is a part of your identity that is missing. And very often, that emptiness creates room for the ills that accompany loneliness. If we're to revive civil society, developing meaningful relationships with people and creating an environment that fosters a tight-knit local community is vital to that project. But as it stands, many of these trends in friendship and association are continuing to get worse. And this brings us to our next topic. One aspect of American life that doesn't seem to be talked about all that much is the decline in people who are working, and this issue specifically revolves around men. And it's not that these men are just unemployed, because being unemployed would mean that they are looking for work. These men are out of the labor force altogether. They are not even looking for work. And we're talking about men in their prime working age, from 25 to 54, and around 7 to 10 million of them. This is not an issue that should be taken lightly. There are serious consequences involved in specifically having men not working. And what's interesting about this specific subgroup of Americans is that the number of men who are not in the labor force at all seems to have hardly any correlation with the impact of economic recessions. It's been a nearly consistent curve with only minor bumps, and if anything, recessions seem to slow the growth of this group. This is something else entirely. Just think of what the country would look like if there were over 7 to 10 million more workers in the economy. And just speaking from an angle of personal finance, ages 25 to 54 are those crucial ages where you are supposed to be accumulating wealth and savings. If you are not working, you are not accumulating wealth, and you are way more likely to end up in poverty. Moreover, the longer you're out of the workforce, the less likely you are to even be considered as a candidate for any job opportunity. So who are these non-workers? Where do they come from? And why is this important? Well, political economist and demographer Nicholas Eberstadt has probably done some of the most extensive work in looking into this population of non-working men in this country, and some of his findings are really worrying. For one, there are more men alive today who are not working than there were at the beginning and at the tail end of the Great Depression. According to the 1930 census, 91.2% of men aged 25 to 54 were employed. In the 1940 census, 86.4% of those men were employed. In 2015, 84.4% of prime-age men were employed. Even when you account for the fact that the early census readings didn't separate out civilian non-institutional populations from the total population count, the number today is still worse than it was during one of the most severe economic depressions in the history of this country. And this doesn't even have to do with a change in the age structure as many have theorized. Looking at the long-term age structure adjusted employment to population ratio from 1967 to 2015, there is still an increase in the men who are simply not in the labor force. As Nicholas Eberstadt writes, in the decade of the 1960s, monthly averages indicated that 1 in 16 prime-age American men were not at work. By the 1990s, the ratio had jumped to 1 in 8. In the current decade, January 2010 to June 2016, the ratio has dropped below 1 in 6 for an average of 17.5% of prime-age men with no paid work in the past month. Even when accounting for all of the men today who are in the middle of obtaining an education or simply taking up job training, the numbers are still worse today than they were during the time of the Great Depression. Even after generously adjusting for today's demanding regimen of adult schooling and training, the net jobs deficit in 2015 for men 20 to 64 in relation to 1965 era work patterns would come out to a number approaching 10 million. We now have an army of men who are not working. In fact, this reality is so often ignored by most news outlets that discounting over 7 million men from the workforce is still considered an economy at full employment. We are not even including these non-working men in most of our job statistics. This is all just brushed off to the side. But now that we've introduced the problem, there's another question to be asked. What exactly are all of these not in the labor force men doing with their time? Well, when economists Mark Aguiar and Eric Hurst conducted a time use survey of Americans from 1965 to 2005, which is just a survey of what respondents did on the previous day, they noted what they called an increase in leisure among prime-age men with little education. In 1965, both educated men and men who hadn't completed high school both shared the same amount of leisure time, with only a 2-hour difference between the groups. But between 1985 and 2005, quote, men who had not completed high school increased their leisure time by 8 hours per week, while men who had completed college decreased their leisure time by 6 hours per week. And as Charles Murray notes in Coming Apart, the worst results were found among men without jobs. In 2003 to 2005, men who were not employed spent less time on job search, education, training, and doing useful things around the house than they had in 1985. They spent less time on civic and religious activities. They didn't even spend their leisure time on active pastimes such as exercise, sports, hobbies, or reading. All of those figures were lower in 2003 to 2005 than they had been in 1985. How did they spend that extra leisure time? Sleeping and watching television. The increase in television viewing was especially large. from 27.7 hours per week in 1985 to 36.7 hours in 2003 to 2005. Employed men with no more than high school diplomas also goofed off more in 2003 to 2005 than in 1985, but less consistently and with smaller differentials. Socializing, relaxing, and leisure are akin to a full-time job for the unworking American male, according to Nicholas Eberstadt. And just what sorts of diversions do unworking men engage in during their roughly 8 hours a day of socializing, relaxing, and leisure? Men who neither work nor look for work commit more time to attending gambling establishments, tobacco and drug use, and listening to the radio than either working men and women or unemployed men. Conversely, unworking men spend less time in the following activities than any other group: attending museums, attending performing arts, and attending movies/films. In the ATUS category, television and movies, not religious, the contrast is so enormous as to suggest a fundamental difference in culture. For unworking men, this category consumes an average of 5.5 hours a day, nearly 800 hours a year more for not in the labor force men than unemployed men, 1,200 plus hours more than men with jobs, and nearly 1,400 hours more than working women. And according to statistics from the General Social Survey, in 2004, the most recent figures available, 8% of men with work said they used some illegal drugs over the past year, 22% of unemployed men reported illegal drug use, and nearly 31% of unworkers admitted to illegal drug use. In fact, as economist Tyler Cowen noted in his book Big Business, the Google search term that correlates most closely with the unemployment rate in any given American county is not any term that might be connected to a job search. Instead, it is Slutload, a well-known pornographic site. This is idleness at its worst. There is a reason why most traditional religions consider idleness to be one of the worst things you can do to your soul.
Idle hands are the devil's workshop.
But even secular reformers of the early 20th century considered idleness to be a grave social ill. As the British reformer Lord William Beveridge explains, idleness is not the same as want. It is a positive separate evil from which men do not escape by having an income. Idleness, even on an income, corrupts. Nicholas Eberstadt also has a good way of putting this. Bluntly stated, leisure refines and elevates while idleness corrupts and degrades. He continues, by every indicator, not in the labor force men look to be less socially engaged than men with work. With respect to participation in civil society, there is a long-standing pattern of lower religious attendance for unworking men than for working ones, and unworking men are much less likely to have volunteered over the previous months than working men. Daily newspaper reading is appreciably lower for the unworking than the working. Working men are consistently more likely to vote than unworking men. Moreover, most of these men are less likely to have been married and more likely to have been divorced. This is not a particularly strong phenomenon amongst married people, which also seems to correlate with the fact that most men not in the labor force spend less time caring for children or other family members than do their employed or even unemployed counterparts. So this leads us into another question. How exactly are these guys supporting themselves? Where are you getting your money from if you're not working? Well, one answer can be found in the precipitous rise in physical disability for the last half-century, which is rather counterintuitive to all of the major advances in technology, medicine, and workplace conditions over that same time period. Fewer people today do any sort of backbreaking work throughout their livelihoods compared to people in the 20th century. And if they are doing intensive labor, a lot of it is being done by machinery and other technologies. Also, our medical advances today are far better than they were during the 20th century. Yet, as Charles Murray writes, the percentage of people qualifying for federal disability benefits because they are unable to work rose from 0.7% of the size of the labor force in 1960 to 5.3% in 2010. As the Social Security Administration's annual statistical report shows, the rise in people claiming disability from being unable to work is staggering, especially when nothing else surrounding these definitions has changed. The rising trend line is not produced by changes in the legal definition of physical disability or the pool of people who qualify for benefits. Both have been tweaked but not substantially changed since 1960. Increases in substance abuse don't explain it either. Substance abuse is not a qualifying disability. Maybe some of the growth in the 1960s can be explained by disabled people first learning about the program. But the rest of the trend line reflects in part an increase in the number of people seeking to get benefits who aren't really unable to work. An increase in Americans for whom the founding virtue of industriousness is not a big deal anymore. And as Nicholas Eberstadt found in Men Without Work, the living expenses of unworking men today are subsidized by Uncle Sam. According to the ASEC, the average amount of government benefits received by working prime-age men was just over $500 in 2014. For unworking prime-age men, the average was about $5,700, over 10 times as much. unworking prime-age men reportedly drew about 2.5 times as much in the way of government support as their unemployed counterparts. But it's also likely that these numbers severely underestimate the extent to which government aid is being dispensed here, because the data collection for government benefits almost always tends to be underreported. According to a 2015 study in New York City, the current population survey conducted by the Census Bureau missed, quote, over 1/3 of housing assistance recipients, 40% of food stamp recipients, and 60% of TANF and general assistance recipients. And as Eberstadt writes, it also found that the dollar amounts of welfare transfers were dramatically underreported. But as a general matter, 63% of homes with unworking men reportedly received such assistance, 41% lived on food stamps, and 53% reported being on Medicaid. In addition, such welfare dependence for not in the labor force men seems to have shot up by nearly 20 percentage points since 1985. By and large, these are men making a living by gaming our disability system. And the easier it is to game the system, the more likely you are to stay a non-worker, even if there are actual employment opportunities for you elsewhere. So even if obtaining a job was just a matter of moving somewhere else where there are suitable jobs, our welfare system incentivizes these people to stay right where they are. Now, what a lot of this rise in disability can also be attributed to is the proliferation of opioids. As economist Alan Kruger details in a journal in the Brookings Papers on economic activity, prime-age men who are out of the labor force report that they experience notably lower levels of emotional well-being throughout their days, and that they derive relatively little meaning from their daily activities, and that nearly half of prime-age non-labor force men take pain medications on a daily basis, and in nearly 2/3 of these cases they take prescription pain medication. He also notes that labor force participation has fallen more in areas where relatively more opioid pain medication is prescribed, causing the problem of depressed labor force participation and the opioid crisis to become intertwined. Now, we'll get more into drugs later on in the video, but for now, just know that disability payments and other government welfare guarantees are largely how these men are supporting themselves, and that includes receiving the welfare payments of other family members, as well as being dependent on girlfriends. And while most men out of the labor force aren't living in abject poverty, they don't have a terrible standard of living. As Eberstadt notes, if we control for price changes in household size, per capita spending power was about 14% higher for prime-age male non-working homes in 2014 than in 1996. All in all, non-working men, and by extension, the great majority of non-working men who were not looking for work, appear to be better off than tens of millions of other Americans today, including the millions of single mothers who are either working or seeking work. So here we have a pretty significant measure in the decay of civil society, and one that's gone largely invisible. The idea of work as a source of self-actualization, as a place for making meaningful connections in your life, is an incredibly important factor in sustaining a foundation of mediating institutions. The decline of work opens the way for moral degradation and impoverishment. Losing 7 to 10 million people from the American workforce has made our country far less productive than it could be and has made for paltry economic growth. Simply put, males are not as industrious today as they were in decades past, and the incentives to not be industrious have been growing as our standard of living has increased. As Eberstadt writes, having freed themselves in some large measure of such obligations, they have filled their days instead with the full-bore pursuit of more immediate sources of gratification, and not all of them admirable or even gratifying. Men who are out of the workforce exasperates the breakdown of families we've been talking about. It corrodes civic engagement in the creation of real human communities. It creates more distrust and idleness, and has led many of these men to take up drugs to fill their souls. And it has created an army of men dependent on government handouts and the success of everyone else to support their lifestyles. Nicholas Eberstadt concludes by saying that the data may be read to suggest that something akin to infantilization besets all too many unworking men. And more than giving human beings a sense of their identity, work instills basic notions of discipline. You need to show up on time, be able to do what you're told, dress and behave appropriately, be prepared for stress, and eventually have the tolerance for other stressful environments outside of work. Essentially, as Tim Carney makes the argument, it turns you into someone who has been appropriately shaped for being marriageable material, for building a family. All of the stress you encounter at work will translate over into the responsibilities of raising children, and ultimately being a family guy.
He said it! He said it!
In this way, work acts as a kind of civilizing tool. It's not everything, but it certainly matters. It matters for instilling discipline, it matters for the functioning of communities, and it matters for the human spirit. Which leads us into our next topic. Most people already seem to be aware of the decline in religious belief and church attendance, but I would wager that a significant portion of the country is either indifferent to this fact, or might even be cheery about it. So for this section, I'll just say that it would be best to hold off your opinions on religion. The facts that I'm going to discuss here are the facts. And I say that because internet people are generally needlessly aggressive against anything religious, or go into a raging secular mode. And I say that as someone who is rather a-religious myself, though I do appreciate the philosophical depth of the world of religion. But anyway, to restate, church attendance, followed by religious belief, have seen a slow decline over the last half century, and particularly in the last 20 years. As a recent article from AP writes, the percentage of US adults who belong to a church or other religious institution has plunged by 20 percentage points over the past 2 decades, hitting a low of 50% last year. Gallup said church membership was 70% in 1999, and close to or higher than that figure for most of the 20th century. Since 1999, the figure has fallen steadily, while the percentage of US adults with no religious affiliation has jumped from 8% to 19%. David Crary goes on to note that over that 20-year period in regard to political affiliation, church membership among Democrats fell from 71% to 48%, compared to a more modest drop from 77% to 69% among Republicans. This is another sad fact of American life over the last few decades. More and more now, any sort of religious affiliation by Americans is being viewed along political lines. This is something I'll get into later on in the video, but as it pertains to current day realities, the more one identifies themselves as religious, the more likely they are to be viewed as a Republican, which is pretty disappointing because I know plenty of religious Democrats, and this is just another attempt at needless division. But as the state of political polarization gets worse, this kind of dividing line becomes more distinct. But solely sticking to levels of religiosity, the rise of the religious nones, or people who subscribe to no religion at all, has been a growing share of the population, with at least 1 in 3 of all millennials saying they are religiously unaffiliated. And according to a 2014 Pew Research report, religious commitment, as measured by respondents' self-assessments of religion's importance in their lives, frequency of prayer and religious attendance, has declined among men and women, college graduates and those with less education, married and unmarried respondents, and people in every region of the country and people with various racial and ethnic backgrounds. And this sudden decline in religiosity has been the reversal of a trend beginning since the founding, where more people were becoming religious in this country, with the apex being the middle of the 20th century. As Tim Carney knows from religious historian Philip Hammond, ever since the nation's founding, a higher and higher proportion of Americans have affiliated with a church or synagogue, right through the 1950s. And as Robert Putnam notes in Bowling Alone, in the 1960s, churches and synagogues were packed, as more Americans worshiped together than only a few decades earlier, perhaps more than ever in American history. So why exactly is any of this important? Why does it matter that religious nones are on the rise and attendance has declined? Because the community around the church, the people who get together every week and organize their lives around that institution, act as a vital core for developing and maintaining institutions of civil society. As Charles Murray writes, religion is one of the key sources of social capital in a community. The people who generate that social capital through their churches and synagogues are not necessarily people who believe fervently in every theological doctrine of their faith. They may or may not. But the people who, when asked by the GSS interviewer, report that they attend worship services regularly and have a strong affiliation with their religion are the people who teach in Sunday school, staff the booths at charity fund drives, take the synagogue's youth group on outings, arrange help for bereaved families, and serve as deacons. Simply put, religious people are some of the most actively involved in their local communities. Almost everything I mentioned in the previous section is much weaker among the religious. And this is largely due in part to the sheer amount of activities that religiously affiliated people are involved in. As Robert Putnam writes, regular worshippers and people who say that religion is very important to them are much more likely than other people to visit friends, to entertain at home, to attend club meetings, and to belong to sports groups, professional and academic societies, school service groups, youth groups, service clubs, hobby or garden clubs, literary, art, discussion, and study groups, school fraternities and sororities, farm organizations, political clubs, nationality groups, and other miscellaneous groups. In fact, religiously involved people seem simply to know more people. One intriguing survey that asked people to enumerate all individuals with whom they had had a face-to-face conversation in the course of the day found that religious attendance was the most powerful predictor of the number of one's daily personal encounters. Regular church attendees reported talking with 40% more people in the course of the day. It is clear that religious people are unusually active social capitalists. And aside from these community activities, people who are religiously affiliated also give the most to charity and are far more likely to volunteer. Putnam continues, religious involvement is an especially strong predictor of volunteering and philanthropy. About 75 to 80% of church members give to charity, as compared with 55 to 60% of non-members. And 50 to 60% of church members volunteer, while only 30 to 35% of non-members do. In part, of course, this is because churches themselves do things that require funds and volunteers, but religious adherents are also more likely to contribute time and money to activities beyond their own congregation. Even excluding contributions to religious causes, active involvement in religious organizations is among the strongest predictors of both philanthropy and volunteering. In one survey of 22 different types of voluntary associations, from hobby groups to professional associations, to veterans groups to self-help groups, to sports clubs to service clubs, it was membership in religious groups that was most closely associated with other forms of civic involvement, like voting, jury service, community projects, talking with neighbors, and giving to charity. And this isn't the only thing that churches can provide. Churches provide an important incubator for civic skills, civic norms, community interests, and civic recruitment. Religiously active men and women learn to give speeches, run meetings, manage disagreements, and bear administrative responsibility. They also befriend others who are in turn likely to recruit them into other forms of community activity. In part for these reasons, churchgoers are substantially more likely to be involved in secular organizations, to vote and participate politically in other ways, and to have deeper informal social connections. In fact, your level of religiosity is just as strong an indicator of civic engagement as your level of education. But all of this is in large part due to the fact of both regular attendance, belief, and the doctrines found within the church itself. The more likely you are to view the actions of your existence in servitude to a higher order, the more likely you are to sacrifice your time, labor, and money to virtuous ends. There is a reason why a majority of all congregations around the country have consistently been shown to contribute to developments around their local communities and social services and other neighborhood projects. As Putnam writes, Partners for Sacred Places found that the overwhelming majority, 93%, of older urban congregations provide community services such as food pantries, self-help groups, and recreational groups, and that 80% of the beneficiaries of these programs are not members of the congregations. There is a larger service being done to the local community by your religious neighbors. And for the most part, if you're in a family that is particularly adherent to the doctrines of your church, these values are instilled throughout childhood. So one grows up in such an environment and develops the skills necessary for these ends. But the more that church attendance and religious adherence is on the decline, the less this kind of moral education occurs within the household, and the more space that is left for ethical and moral indifference. I think the blatant difference in numbers between secular and religious community participation exemplifies that. And as John Carroll writes in his essay on the state and fading community, family values are reinforced by other social groups, including the extended family, church, sporting clubs, and schools. Remove any group from this crisscrossing network and the communal glue weakens. A priest or minister reinforces personal morality. He strengthens the resolve of parents in constraining rebellious teenagers and may influence those teenagers directly. As church attendance declines, so does the pastor's influence. But not only is religion a major component of civil society and spiritual fulfillment, going back to our previous topic, religion also plays a major role in satisfaction with marriage. According to recent data from the Institute for Family Studies, those who reported being a highly religious couple were far more likely to enjoy higher levels of relationship quality and sexual satisfaction compared to their peers in secular or less/mixed religious relationships. Which is particularly good if we're thinking about the beginning of this video and ways to maintain stable families. Regardless of whether or not you are religious, intact and stable families are a net good and should be championed. Moreover, those who attend religious services more often also tend to have 0.27 more children than those who never attend. And I don't care what the population activists say, more people is good. But one of the more interesting facts out there is that people who live in wealthier communities also tend to be more religious. In fact, as Yuval Levin writes in The Fractured Republic, more educated Americans are significantly more attached to traditional religious institutions. The aforementioned UVA sociologist Bradford Wilcox has found that church attendance has declined twice as fast among Americans with no more than a high school diploma as among those with a college degree in recent decades. University of Nebraska sociologist Philip Schwadl, examining data from the General Social Survey, found that with each additional year of education, the likelihood of attending religious services increased by 15%. These figures show that Americans at the top are living far more stable lives and are much more firmly attached to core social institutions than Americans at the bottom today, and that these differences are growing. The basic experience of American life looks remarkably different at these different ends of our society, and there is less and less of a middle between them. So the image of the huddled poor masses listening to someone preach the Bible isn't really what's going on in America. It's the educated who are more religious, and we'll get more into this later. But for most of the poor, left behind places in America, the religious core of those communities has been virtually decimated. And when this religious core is so unsubstantial as to make any difference, that is a major source of social capital and opportunities that a town is missing out on. The network of associations that comes with the church, as well as its spiritual nature, is vital for a town's people to get ahead and feel a part of something. The church offers a moral foundation for a healthy community, for participation in civil society, and as attendance and belief declines, fewer people are receiving these tenets. As Yuval Levin summarizes, the ultimate soul-forming institutions in a free society are frequently religious institutions. Traditional religion offers a direct challenge to the ethic of the age of fracture. Religious commitments command us to a mixture of responsibility, sympathy, lawfulness, and righteousness that align our wants with our duties. They help form us to be free. That is not why they draw the allegiance of liberal citizens, of course. People are drawn to what they understand to be the truth their faith reveals. But the role of religious institutions in enabling our free society to thrive is nonetheless an additional important reason for that society to value and protect them. And on top of that, religious people are simply more likely to be happy. According to data from the General Social Survey comprised by Charles Murray, the more that one attends religious services and is involved in the community of their church and their faith, the more that one responds as being happier in life. And it's almost perfectly ordered with the frequency of attendance. And this also doesn't really have that much of a correlation with the intensity of religious conviction. Even self-purported religious fundamentalists who only attended church once a year said they were very happy 22% of the time, while more religious moderates or religious liberals who were less confident in their faith but attended church weekly reported being very happy at around 42 and 41%. In fact, when you combine everything else from the aforementioned categories, life satisfaction is far more likely to be reported. The more satisfied you are with your work, the happier you are. The better your marriage is, the happier you are. And the more you're involved in your local community, the happier you are. The statistics from the Social Capital Benchmark Survey was probably the most significant for me. The more one is engaged in activities in their local community having to do with group involvement, organized group interactions, giving and volunteering, informal social interactions, and electoral politics, the more one is to report being very happy. But this should also be somewhat intuitive. As Murray notes, all four of these categories are where the stuff of life happens. With people, with your family, at your job, and with your relationship to your faith. The more that these four indicators are copacetic, the more life satisfaction one has. Now again, putting aside your thoughts on religion, this evidence is certainly something to contend with, and deserves to be recognized as such. But also, it is not a preordained fact of life that you must have all four of these indicators work in tandem in your life. Maybe your job really sucks, but you have a fantastic family life. Sure, that's certainly true as well. But the point with regards to all four of these factors is that they essentially form the core of what we've been talking about for this entire video. Civil society. As marriages decline and divorce becomes the norm, as people are no longer involved in their communities and have only few friends, as the value of work and industriousness tanks, and religious attendance and belief is on the decline, is it any wonder that people might feel more meaningless than ever before now? Is it any wonder that more Americans say that they are lonely, or that life satisfaction has tanked and depression is on the rise? These four measurements form the core understanding of civil society. The closer you are in directing your life toward these ends and in accordance with virtue properly understood, the closer you are to the American dream. The closer you are to utter life satisfaction and meaning, feeling dignified and with purpose. All of these factors form the basis for a real human community, and all of these factors have been on the decline. Now, the issue of social media is also the most recent one to occur, and a lot of the research on the subject is still up in the air, though there is definitely some tangible information to work with. Ever since the rise of social media platforms like MySpace, Facebook, and YouTube in the early 2000s, as well as the rise of smartphones all over the world, the degree to which our perception of what constitutes meaningful relationships, as well as the way in which we use our time, has shifted dramatically. As Jacob Weisberg wrote in the New York Review of Books in 2016, Americans spend an average of 5.5 hours a day with digital media, more than half of that time on mobile devices. Once out of bed, we check our phones 221 times a day, an average of every 4.3 minutes. And according to a 2019 Pew Research poll, about 3 in 10 US adults say they are almost constantly online. And of those ages 18 to 29, 48% say that they are almost constantly online. And I don't think people realize the extent to which they use their smartphones. For me, I use mine as an alarm clock, to play music, podcasts, YouTube videos, scrolling through Twitter, texting, checking my mail, checking on this channel, checking the weather, checking the news, and to call and FaceTime relatives. But thankfully, since my phone has been slowly deteriorating, I can't really play that many games anymore, or watch any Netflix videos. Though that's also due to a habit of no longer playing video games or really using streaming services. But I can imagine for most people that that's not really the case. This technology is increasingly taking up more and more of our time. And when we're staring at our crotch for 5.5 hours, that's 5.5 hours you're spending not actually physically engaging with other people. That's 5.5 hours of constantly receiving a version of the world that is slightly off kilter, that's catered to what you want to see and how you want to see it. More than that, all of the time spent on social media is deliberately designed so that you get addicted to it. And news sites deliberately title their headlines in such a way to make you engage with the content, without even having read the material. And when you do click on the article, you'll get recommended a bunch of other clickbaity headlines, just so they can make more money off of psychologically manipulating your behavior. And let's be real here, most people aren't actually reading the articles they click on. If anything, they read the clickbaity headline, and then they read maybe the first paragraph, and then they're done. Like, retweet, share, look what kind of bullshit happened today, guys, I'm angry. And this kind of addictive structure of social media and smartphones has been made explicit by their creators. After the first iPad came out, Steve Jobs specifically said that iPads were not allowed in his household, and he will not allow his kids to use them because, quote, we think it's too dangerous for them. Understand that almost every public school uses iPads in the classroom now. We used iPads in my high school, so everyone else's kids can use these dangerous tools, but not mine. Bill Gates similarly limited screen time for his kids and didn't let his kids get cell phones until they were 14. The former president of Facebook, Sean Parker, stated in 2017 that Facebook, quote, literally changes your relationship with society, with each other. We need to give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while, because someone liked your comment on a photo or a post or whatever. It's a social validation feedback loop, exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with, because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains. A former Facebook executive also said that the company uses short-term dopamine-driven feedback loops that are destroying how society works. The CEO of Snap in 2017 admitted that social media has come at a huge cost to facts, our minds, and the entire media industry, and said that social media sites are designed to fuel fake news and outrage because it's all dependent on what you and your friends share to each other and how that affects the algorithm. As Adam Alter, author of Irresistible, writes about companies like Facebook and Twitter, the companies that are producing these products, the very large tech companies in particular, are producing them with the intent to hook. They're doing their very best to ensure not that our well-being is preserved, but that we spend as much time on their products and on their programs and apps as possible. That's their key goal. It's not to make a product that people enjoy and therefore becomes profitable, but rather to make a product that people can't stop using and therefore becomes profitable. And as he writes in Wired, it seems as if they were following the cardinal rule of drug dealing: never get high on your own supply. But aside from its addictive quality, what the rise of social media, and the internet more broadly, has done is to give people an avenue to escape into virtual communities. If you can get more joy out of being online and hanging out with Shadow Dude 359, then eventually that's going to replace a lot of the value you do get from being with real people. And more than that, it strains any relationship you do have with real people. If you see your friend post a photo of themselves at the beach, having a great time with all their other friends, you're more apt to look at your own life in disappointment, because you perceive yourself as not having as good a time as your friend is. This is often the phenomenon that happens with a site like Instagram, where all there is people posting photos of the best moments of their day. And so when you look at these photos, you start to either feel left out, or you see yourself as being inadequate. But what we don't realize is that people's profiles are catered in such a way so that they can project onto the world that their lives are fantastic and full of nothing but joy. You're getting a false perception of someone else's life and internalizing that false perception, which consequently makes you more depressed. We'll talk more about this later, but one of the effects this has had is to make people retreat more into their virtual communities on YouTube, Facebook, or 4chan, because at least there you can find like-minded people that don't seem to exist in the real world. But the thing is, this isn't real human interaction. You not only have a barrier between a physical person, but you're removing any engagement of your 5 senses. Social media claim to be liberating us from the boundaries of space and time, but it's also made us more isolated and devoid of real community and what it means to be human. As Nicholas Carr argued in his 2011 book, The Shallows, The internet is literally changing the way our brains function. It changes the way we consume information, our tolerance for patience, and our behavior. We can hardly concentrate anymore without being exposed to some new flashy image popping up on a screen. People don't think deeply anymore. Many of us can hardly read a book for an hour without the need for something entertaining to distract us. According to a 2014 study from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average American spends only 19 minutes a day reading. How are you supposed to be a serious citizen competent enough to engage in arguments in self-government if you can't even pay attention long enough to consume them? This is even worse for teenagers. Teenagers ages 15 to 19 spend just 4.2 minutes a day reading. And can you guess what's taking up all their time? The internet. Our habitual practices are changing. The way we compartmentalize in our head is changing. The way we think is changing. We're bleeding out our ears! No, I'm just kidding. Though there is a larger conversation to be had about humans and our interaction with technology, but that's not for here. Anyway, all of this is particularly troubling for people in my age range. I'm a Gen Zer, and while I didn't get my first phone until I was 14, the last day of my freshman year of high school actually, for most of my peers, it seemed as though they all got their phones by the time they were in the 6th or 7th grade. And as Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt laid out in the recent book Coddling of the American Mind, the interactions between young people and technology is not something we should be overlooking. Young people are now so anxious that many of us dread to answer the phone, or even call someone over just texting them. Because we've grown up having phones, we're all used to just texting each other, and taking our time to write carefully thought out responses, that when we do try to socialize with other people, we're more prone to fits of anxiety, because we can't meticulously plan out our responses to other people when we're standing right in front of them.
Hey, so, do you like memes?
Which only incentivizes the retreat into our phones, because at least there we know that we can communicate properly. As much as our phones seem like they connect us, as much as they seem like they make us function properly, persistent use does seem to have some detrimental effects. The forum board, or the Twitter thread, or the Discord voice chat is not comparable to real face-to-face interactions. And it can't be more obvious that this is true when you read some of the most intense hate comments online, only to find out that the person would never actually say such things to you in person. The anonymity factor of the internet allows people to indulge in their worst selves, because they face no immediate consequences for it, and can hide behind a screen somewhere. But there is a disconnect that occurs with the internet. As Jean Twenge and her co-authors wrote in an article in the Clinical Psychological Science Journal, it is worth remembering that humans' neural architecture evolved under conditions of close, mostly continuous face-to-face contact with others, and that a decrease in or removal of a system's key inputs may risk destabilization of the system. A meaningful friendship with someone you physically see is far more valuable than the number you have on your social media account. Being hunkered down and isolated in your home with your virtual friends is not a good substitute. As Andrew Sullivan wrote in New York Magazine, by rapidly substituting virtual reality for reality, we are diminishing the scope of intimate interaction, even as we multiply the number of people with whom we interact. We remove or drastically filter all the information we might get by being with another person. We reduce them to some outlines: a Facebook friend, an Instagram photo, a text message, in a controlled and sequestered world that largely exists free of the sudden eruptions or encumbrances of actual human interaction. Yes, I know. Here you are watching me telling you that watching me might not be the best thing for you. Yeah, I get it, people, but just you get the point. But another way in which the rise of social media and the internet have had a damaging impact is in the voice it gives for the most depraved and fringe people of the country. Are you an isolated individual, anxious about your identity and susceptible to sketchy internet blogs ranting about the Zionists? Well, you might just find yourself marching with tiki torches and formulating conspiracy theories about the Holocaust.
Little f***ing c***s! They get ruled by people like me! Little f***ing octoroons! My ancestors f***ing enslaved those pieces of f***ing shit!
Pussy. Race traitor. You work for Jews, you know?
It seems almost inevitable at this point that the more isolated you are from real people, and the more you retreat into the internet, the more comfort you find in your virtual community, where you and other internet people can uncover the truth about the worldwide conspiracy theories involving pizza shops and reinforce your confirmation bias. But what's even more disturbing about the internet reinforcing paranoid or racist attitudes is when those unhealthy attitudes actually start to materialize in dangerous ways in the real world, when people become motivated enough to take physical action against people. Which leads us to one more aspect of decay that has come with the rise of social media. What social media is really good at is arranging its algorithms in just the right way so that you see just what you want to see. If there is information out there that panders to your most base political beliefs about the other side, it's gonna promote it, and it's gonna promote it endlessly. More than that, news companies will deliberately title their articles in such a way so as to get this response out of you, and they'll promote the loudest and most obnoxious voices out there just so they can get your click. What social media is really good at doing at the end of the day is promoting intense political tribalism. The belief that all of your political opponents are literally evil people who must all go to prison or something. Neil Gabler wrote in 2016, "Most of us know the cliches. Social media contributes to more polarization as the like-minded find one another and stoke one another's prejudices and grievances, no matter what end of the political spectrum." Though, despite the fact that it's a cliche, most people continue to buy into it and get agitated whenever they see the latest headline that is designed to trigger them. But what this ultimately does is warp your perception of national politics and the character of your political opponents. And one of the ways in which social media and the news industry do this is by doing something called nitpicking, where they find the smallest incident in some town that no one has ever heard of before and then turn it into a national news story, and smear everyone who has the same political affiliation as that one person as being representative of the entire group. Some Antifa gangs cause trouble in Portland? That's it. Every single Democrat in the country is communist scum. Al-Qaeda has won. 50 Klan members show up to bitch and moan about their superiority? Every single Republican in the country is a Nazi. Dear God, the concentration camps are here. When in reality, these are small incidents with small groups of people and are seriously inapplicable to the entirety of a major political party, and are being highly exaggerated and amplified by the media and bad faith actors online. Moreover, this makes it harder for actual despicable people to be shunned from the public debate when one side or the other claims that all Democrats or all Republicans are just the pure manifestation of evil. But this is the kind of vacuous tribal reaction that these algorithms are set up to get out of you. And the more we feed these things, the worse our polarization gets, and the more difficult it becomes to break that cycle of tribal rage and to even recognize it in ourselves. Especially when people are literally out there encouraging more tribalism. People have literally told me that just because tribalism is embedded in human nature, that you must therefore indulge in it. This is an encouragement to reject reason, the one thing that all human beings are born with. To indulge yourself more in irrational and emotional thinking, and to avoid the notion of prudence altogether. When political tribalism gets this bad, you start thinking of people as mere abstractions. Your political opponents no longer become people anymore. And so everyday politics seems to turn into a competition of who can dehumanize the other in a quicker and more tribal fashion, so you can go back to your tribe and show them just how virtuous you are. But this tendency is in all of us. It's a fact of human nature. And I've been plenty guilty of being more tribal than necessary in the past, and I've tried my best to rectify that. In fact, our political polarization is so bad now that we are more likely to engage in negative partisanship, which is essentially the idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but dumber. So if you're a Democrat and you really liked Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton in 2016, and you thought that Hillary was a highly corrupt person, as soon as Donald Trump attacks her by calling her corrupt, you immediately rush to her aid and defend her imminent glory. And if you're a Republican who held his nose and voted for Trump, even though you said to yourself, yeah, he's the lesser of two evils, or something, which inherently says that he is an evil, as soon as the media goes after him for lying about something new, you immediately rush to his side and claim that he never lies and he's just like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln in all their glory. It's because these people are more or less on your side. They're part of the same team. So an attack on one is an attack on all, and you must defend your tribe, especially since the enemy is so much worse. This is what a lot of our current political tribalism is all about. So while a vote for Donald Trump is more likely to be motivated by your disdain for Democrats, even when Democrats attack Donald Trump, you rush to his defense because it's the Democrats that are attacking him, and Democrats are bad, and vice versa. This is also why whenever a dissenting voice can be heard from your own political aisle, such as from the Never Trumpers or internecine Democratic debates, the attacks on them can at times be worse than the attacks on your political opponents. Because how can we tolerate this dissension from the tribe? Treason! This is in large part why it seems like politics is so loud and stupid, because everyone is just defending their tribe from what they see as pure evil. And so you lose the range of nuance and stop engaging in good faith conversations. I mean, I am personally at the point now where whenever I talk to someone and they immediately say something along the lines of, well, you know, all Republicans secretly believe in the doctrines of Hitler, or, yeah, well, everyone knows Democrats love eating baby parts. I just zone out and start thinking about the fate of humanity. Actually, across the country today, more people are self-segregating themselves by political affiliation. This is what Bill Bishop called the big sort, where you're less likely to encounter someone of the opposing political party, or even live next to them, and you're consequently more likely to have your worst convictions about them go uncontested, especially when it's being aided by social media algorithms and tribal personalities, to the point where your perception of the other side is wildly off base. And a recent survey from More in Common called The Perception Gap, How False Impressions Are Pulling Americans Apart, does a really good job at analyzing this. As part of their findings, they say that Democrats and Republicans imagine that almost twice as many people on the other side hold extreme views than they really do. On average, Democrats and Republicans believe that 55% of their opponents' views are extreme, but in reality, only 30% are. Americans with more partisan views hold more exaggerated views of their opponents. Consumption of most forms of media, including talk radio, newspapers, social media, and local news, is associated with a wider perception gap. Furthermore, those who post about politics on social media show a substantially larger perception gap than those who do not. They even found perception gaps among those who are most educated. Higher education among Democrats, but not Republicans, corresponds with a wider perception gap. For example, Democrats who hold a postgraduate degree are 3 times as inaccurate than those who did not graduate high school. This may be due in part to lower friendship diversity, as higher educated Democrats, but not Republicans, are more likely to say that almost all of their friends share their political views. The wider people's perception gap, the more likely they are to attribute negative personal qualities, like hateful or brainwashed, to their opponents. Overall, Americans' views are more similar to their political opponents than they realize. They also found correlations between the type of preferred media outlet and an accurate perception of reality. So if you're spending your time reading Breitbart, listening to talk radio, or reading sites like BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, and Slate, you are much more likely to have no idea what you are talking about when it comes to how your political opponents actually think. In fact, the closer you get to religious news sources or broadcast news, the more likely you are to have a realistic picture of what's going on. And in another recent study from James Fishkin and Larry Diamond as part of their American One Room project, the more that people just have discussions with others of the opposing political party, the less entrenched their policy positions become, and the more likely they are to move to the center. As the authors of the study find, the more that Republicans engage in conversation with Democrats, the less absolutist they become with their stance on immigration, and the more they find themselves supporting visas for high-skilled workers in DACA. And the more that Democrats engage in conversation with Republicans, the less likely they are to support a $15 minimum wage, and the more likely they are to oppose basic universal income. The most polarizing proposals, whether from the left or the right, generally lost support, and a number of more centrist proposals moved to the foreground. Crucially, proposals further to the right typically lost support from Republicans, and proposals further to the left typically lost support from Democrats. My opinions have changed, more toward the center than toward any one side, noted a tattooed man in a cowboy hat from Colorado. The country is not as divided as the media make it seem. And another good thing about the reality behind the tribal hatred for one another is that according to a 2018 study by More in Common, a study of America's polarized landscape, when asked whether the differences between Americans are too big for us to work together anymore, or not so big that we cannot get together, 77% of Americans still say the latter. So while that's reassuring, the general perception that I'm getting from the public sphere still seems to suggest otherwise. Oh, and for what it's worth, we know that hostile foreign governments like Russia are deliberately pushing this kind of insane tribal outrage culture online with their bots. Because the more time they can get us hating on each other and striking division, the less we focus on what's going on outside of our country. But in summary, we're now no longer able to tolerate our political opponents. We're segregating ourselves into political identities. We are constantly fed a cycle of tribal outrage media that just keeps us angry and addicted to news all the time. But despite the fact that we're tired of it all, we still can't seem to get over it. We're addicts. Now, to avoid the perception of being that guy who wants to destroy the cars because they took my horse and carriage business away, obviously the internet has been one of the best things to have ever been introduced to the public. I mean, come on, the only reason you're listening to my pitiful attempts at proselytizing you is because this technology exists. The only reason why I can get obscure books with free 2-day shipping is because the internet has made international shipping costs so unbelievably efficient and inexpensive. I can talk to people thousands of miles away from me. I can learn things from people that, who knows if I would have ever had access to without the internet. I think guys like Venkatesh Rao or Tyler Cowen are far more optimistic about things pertaining to the virtual world than I am, but they certainly do make worthwhile points. But anyway, that's part of the issue with social media. The good, the bad, the ear bleeding, and the fueling of tribal outrage and identity crises. Oh, and for a final, but kind of trivial category, yeah, it's also very likely that the increase in dog ownership is the direct result of people substituting human interactions for dogs. or at least trying to find a cure for their loneliness. I mean, dog ownership isn't a bad thing, but as Jonah Goldberg notes, they're not supposed to be used to buttress your retreat from social life, but to facilitate socialization, because they make you go out of the house and eventually run into other people. So while dog ownership isn't really the cause of anything, I mean, dogs are great. It's more that their increased ownership is a reflection of people's desire for some sort of intimate connection with something, anything, that they aren't getting in their personal lives. Crazy Cat Lady exists for a reason. Oh, but I also can't say that this phenomenon is solely restricted to the material world.
This here is Chloe. She's the best virtual dog a PC user could ever ask for. Have a treat.
So there's just a brief measure of the decay of civil society. Things are not really looking good on these fronts. And while these measures continue to fall apart, our society has been continually bifurcating, fracturing, and becoming polarized to such a degree that many people genuinely worry for the future of the country. And I think starting the conversation by looking at these measurements is the most crucial place to begin. The essential building block of civilization, the family, is slowly corroding, being replaced by poor substitutes and self-gratification. People spend less time with friends, preferring instead to see themselves and become more atomized individuals. All of the vital outlets for social interaction, from the workplace to the church to the PTA and simple volunteer associations, have been in decline, with the ever-increasing method of interaction being through the digital screen of anonymity and distance from genuine human contact. And this is where we get to the point about what the American dream really is. Is it really all about wealth, or the opportunity to obtain wealth? How about status? Well, maybe not. In his book Coming Apart, Charles Murray suggests otherwise. The American project was not about maximizing national wealth, nor international dominance. The American project consists of the continuing effort, begun with the founding, to demonstrate that human beings can be left free as individuals and families to live their lives as they see fit, coming together voluntarily to solve their joint problems. The polity based on that idea led to a civic culture that was seen as exceptional by all the world. That culture was so widely shared among Americans that it amounted to a civil religion. To be an American was to be different from other nationalities, in ways that Americans treasured. And in Alienated America, Tim Carney relays a similar message. The materialistic view of the American dream misses the point. The worst analyses assume that wealth, or the opportunity for wealth, is the American dream. Slightly better, some analyses see wealth as the necessary precondition of other goods, like intact families or strong public schools. But maybe the things we think accompany the American dream are the things that really are the American dream. What if the T-ball game, the standing room only high school Christmas concert, the parish potluck, and decorating the community hall for a wedding, what if those activities are not the dressings around the American dream, but what if they are the American dream? If our foundation of civil society, in our dependence and development of tightly knit and sovereign local communities is the core of the American dream, then it only makes sense to say, based on all of the aforementioned indicators, that this dream is falling apart.